Hey everyone! Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, well-mannered world of a man who never raised his voice, never missed a dinner jacket, and never once flinched while dismantling an empire from the inside. He wasn't a general or a politician, he didn't carry a gun, but he became one of the most mysterious spies in modern history. A name whispered in both MI6 and the KGB, etched in Betrayal and buried in snow. His friends called him Kim. The Soviets called him invaluable. The West just called him a traitor. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely love long, thoughtful history that unfolds like a thriller. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing where these secrets are being heard around the world. Now, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop, maybe make a cup of tea, the English kind. Tonight, we're going back to 1934, to a quiet Cambridge courtyard where a man made a choice that would echo through decades of war, deception, and frozen silence. This is where the spy was born. He would one day vanish into a fog of betrayal, into the icy folds of Moscow's winter, into the files and footnotes of Cold War archives. But long before that, long before anyone whispered his name with suspicion or marked his file with red ink, he was a boy in the heat of British India, standing too straight for a child and watching the empire's shadows stretch over the horizon. Kim Philby wasn't born a traitor, he was born into contradictions. On the surface, he was the embodiment of the empire, Anglo-Saxon lineage, proper upbringing, stiff upper lip. But at the very core, from the moment of his first memories, he belonged to no one. His father, St. John Philby, was a man too strange even for the British Empire he served. Scholar, Arabist, intelligence officer turned anti-imperialist wanderer, St. John had once hunted Lawrence of Arabia through the sands and later championed the cause of Ibn Saud. He knew secrets and languages, traded in loyalty and dissent, and raised his son with the fervor of a prophet exiled from every church. Harold Adrian Russell Philby, nicknamed Kim, after Rudyard Kipling's boy spy who wandered between worlds, was the child of a father who believed in truth, but not necessarily in countries. Home was never permanent. Home was where the latest assignment sent them. Home was wherever British maps were redrawn with ink and arrogance. In India, Kim watched how men bowed differently depending on the uniform. He saw poverty that British officers joked about, and temples described as curiosities. He heard the chants of holy men in the street and the snide remarks in his father's club. Nothing ever quite fit, least of all the boy. St. John's belief was that the empire was decaying from within, rotting with hypocrisy and greed. He didn't preach this. He lived it. He rejected titles, insulted colleagues, and raised his son not to serve England, but to question it. There were no fairy tales in the Philby household, no bedtime stories of brave knights. There were only riddles, moral and political, and a growing tension between the comfort of privilege and the unease of seeing what lay behind it. When Kim was sent to England for his education, it wasn't so much a departure as a casting adrift. India had been the cradle of his identity, but England, cold and ordered, was the arena where his contradictions would mature. First came Westminster School, with its traditions, its punishments, its breeding of power and posture. Kim adapted with eerie ease. He smiled, shook hands, studied hard. He learned the accent, the references, the small, cruel jokes that passed for wit. But beneath the polished manners, something remained alien. He watched his classmates, future leaders and ministers, speak of empire with ownership, not irony. He said little, he observed, he excelled, and inwardly he recoiled. Cambridge was the next step, a place for thinkers, radicals, and those who wished to manage the world through words. Trinity College, with its cloisters and centuries of privilege, gave him the space to refine not just his intellect, but his duplicity. He arrived as Harold Philby, well-bred and already known by some for his academic promise. But he became Kim in the truest sense, not Kipling's noble spy, but a creature of dual allegiances shaped by quiet rebellion. The 1930s were a dangerous time to be thoughtful. Fascism was on the rise in Europe, but so was its ideological twin across the aisle, communism, with its promise of equality, its intellectual allure, its aesthetic of righteous defiance. In the pubs and dormitories of Cambridge, revolution was a fashionable topic. Students debated not whether change was needed, but how violently it should come. Kim Philby did not speak often in those debates. When he did, he was eloquent but careful. He argued with precision, not passion. But privately, he had already begun slipping under the surface. He started meeting men and women who saw the world differently, not as something to be inherited, but as something to be rebuilt. Among them were names that history would soon burn into scandal. Donald Maclean, the charming and troubled diplomat's son, Guy Burgess, brilliant, erratic, and dangerous in every way, and Anthony Blunt, quiet, elegant, and already taking mental notes for powers unknown. Philby stood slightly apart, not because he was better, but because he was more convincing. His talent wasn't in converting others, but in disappearing into their confidence. He could be anything to anyone. A gentleman to the dons, a rebel to the radicals, a lover to the lonely. But within him, the question of belief began to harden into something deeper. He began to read Marx seriously, not as a student, but as an architect might study blueprints. He saw in dialectical materialism not just theory, but a kind of escape, a justification for everything his upbringing had twisted inside him. The guilt of privilege, the shame of empire, the need for meaning. Communism didn't just offer answers, it offered purpose. For a boy who belonged nowhere, ideology was a map. Still, there was no signature on any party ledger. Philby, guided either by instinct or by someone more experienced, never joined the Communist Party. He hovered, learned, but stayed outside the reach of scrutiny. Others wore the badge openly. Philby did not. It made him seem less suspicious, more reliable, more usable. It was during one of those Cambridge evenings, a student debate on foreign policy, forgettable on the surface, that the story truly shifts. Philby had just spoken, briefly but well, and returned to his seat. The room was full of cigarette smoke and murmured approval. That's when he saw the man, not a student, not a professor. Sitting near the back, wearing a slightly outdated suit, the kind that didn't come from Cambridge tailors. The man wasn't applauding. He was watching. Intently, not like someone intrigued, more like someone confirming something he'd long suspected. Philby noticed. He remembered, but the man said nothing that night. Just nodded slightly when Philby glanced his way, then disappeared into the fog outside. And it wasn't until days later, raining, late afternoon, the kind of gloom that clings to English colleges, that the man returned. This time, he spoke. They met in a quiet courtyard, the kind of place where conversations go unnoticed. The man didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "You know what you're doing," he said, voice low and even. "You know who you are. That's enough for us." Philby said nothing, just watched the rain slide off the stone arches above them. "You want to change the world. We do too, but we don't wait for elections." Philby's heart beat faster, not with fear but recognition. "You'll be watched," the man continued. "Observed, tested, but this..." And here, he didn't smile, but his tone softened. "This is the beginning." Then he walked away. No oath was taken, no money exchanged, no paperwork filed. But something irrevocable had been set in motion. The boy who had never quite belonged to England, to India, to anything, had found a cause. Or perhaps a cause had found him. Philby continued his days at Cambridge as if nothing had happened. He played the role of scholar, friend, gentleman. He laughed at the right jokes, signed the right petitions, danced with the right women. But he had been claimed. Over time, his associations deepened. The group that would one day be known as the Cambridge Five, Maclean, Burgess, Blunt, and eventually Cairncross, began to form, not like a conspiracy, but like a gravitational pull. They weren't plotting treason. Not yet. They were simply intelligent, disaffected young men who believed that Britain had failed its own promise and that the future belonged to something else. Something red, something equal, something, at least in theory, pure. Philby watched them all carefully. He never revealed too much, never claimed too strongly. He was already practicing what would one day make him legendary. Not deception in the crude sense, but something far more sophisticated. He could believe and pretend not to. He could lie with the truth in his mouth. Graduation came. Degrees were awarded. Some left for the Foreign Office, others for journalism, others for more education. Philby left with more than credentials. He left with a mission. But no one knew. Not his friends, not his lovers, not even his father. And so it began, not with espionage, not with betrayal, but with a quiet nod in the rain. There was no trumpet, no drama, just the understanding, you will serve the future. He was still just a young man when he left the dreaming spires of Cambridge behind, but his heart beat with a clarity far older. There had been no official send-off, no ceremony to welcome him into what he was becoming. Only that single, rain-streaked meeting, that glance across a courtyard where silence spoke louder than any oath. Kim Philby stepped into the adult world as many of his classmates did, charming, well-read, and impeccably dressed. But unlike them, he now carried a secret so vast that it changed the color of every day. He knew better than to act on it too soon. That was the genius of his handlers, whoever they were, whatever their real names might have been. They didn't rush him. They cultivated him like a rare plant. They reminded him, don't join the Communist Party, not in Britain, not ever. It wasn't about faith, it was about optics. To join would be to mark yourself, and Kim Philby was to remain unmarked. His gift was not to be loud, but to be believed. They didn't need a martyr, they needed a ghost. He took that advice to heart. As others around him shouted slogans, signed petitions, and flirted openly with revolution, he did something far more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. He vanished into the surface. He accepted a position as a freelance journalist, not just any journalist, but one with a known anti-communist bent. It was deliberate, it was brilliant, and it worked. By 1937, the world was unraveling. Spain had become its most visible wound. The Spanish Civil War wasn't just a local conflict, it was a rehearsal for something larger. Fascists versus Republicans, Nazis versus socialists, ideologies clashing with real blood and real bullets. The press descended like vultures, and Philby was among them. He reported from Franco's side, not reluctantly, but with what appeared to be genuine zeal. It was perhaps the greatest lie he ever lived. In print, he praised the fascists for their order, their discipline, their clarity. In smoky cafes, he echoed the right phrases, laughed at the right jokes. He wore a uniform, rode in convoys, posed for photographs with nationalist officers. He watched villages burn, and he wrote about them with just enough distance to seem objective. But his reports, real reports, the kind written in code and sent through carefully guarded channels, went elsewhere. They went to Moscow. His Soviet contacts, when they surfaced, did so quietly. There were no loud exchanges, no meetings in basements. It was all conducted with the elegance of someone playing a long, complicated game of chess. The messages went out. Details of troop movements, supply chains, officers' temperaments. The Soviets were fighting a proxy war in Spain too, and Philby's intelligence helped them anticipate and adapt. Yet even they didn't fully trust him. Not yet. They questioned the performance he was giving. He was too good, too convincing. Was he really one of them? Or had he turned? Somewhere in some dim apartment in Moscow, men debated his soul as he stood on the battlefields of Spain, watching the light drain from the eyes of men he neither hated nor pitied. He never killed anyone. That wasn't his role. He observed, he recorded, and he lied, elegantly, efficiently, without remorse. That, in itself, was a kind of violence. One day, while embedded with nationalist forces, a bomb exploded close to where he had been standing only moments earlier. The officer next to him was torn apart, his uniform shredded, his eyes wide even in death. Philby was knocked to the ground, his hearing lost to a ringing that would haunt him for days. When he stumbled to his feet, blood on his face and ash on his clothes, the photographers rushed in. The pictures appeared in the British press under headlines lauding his bravery. Franco's men, grateful for the favorable coverage, awarded him a medal, a fascist medal, from a fascist general to a Soviet spy. Moscow saw the images too, and that was the moment they stopped doubting. He had bled for the mask. Back in London, his credentials glowed: a brave journalist, a patriot, a survivor. He moved through drawing rooms and government receptions like a man anointed. Old school friends reconnected. The upper class welcomed him without question. His stories from Spain, delivered with charm and wit, made him a favorite at dinners. He never spoke of politics. That, too, was part of the act. But the Soviets weren't just watching. They were adapting. They began feeding him more. More contacts, more tasks, more responsibilities. He was no longer just an observer. He was becoming an asset of value, one whose career had to be cultivated with care. He had proved he could lie convincingly. Now, he would have to do something harder. He would have to convince even himself. There was, at one point, a quiet crisis. A defector from the Soviet ranks had made contact with British intelligence. He carried names, whispers, suspicions, among them a profile that sounded unnervingly familiar. Young, educated, foreign correspondent, suspicious movements, seen in Spain. The file made its way to the desks at MI6, but when they compared the vague description to the glowing reports on Harold Adrian Philby, the decorated war correspondent, the Oxford-accented gentleman, the man with a commendation from Franco, they laughed. It couldn't be him. Preposterous. The defector insisted. The man you're looking for moves like a ghost. He doesn't shout. He listens. He lies like a diplomat. Still, MI6 dismissed it. Some in the service even invited Philby in for lunch. Purely socially, of course. They wanted to hear more about Spain. He entertained them, smiled, poured the wine, and when they raised questions about communists among the press corps, he nodded gravely and said, "Yes, dangerous men, always watching. I had to be careful." Later, his Soviet handler sent him a note, short, terse. He believes, and he lies like a diplomat. Years would pass before that line appeared again, this time in training manuals. In those years, Philby continued to build the life of a man beyond suspicion. He took a position at the Times of London, not just any position, but a respected one. His byline became common in diplomatic circles. He covered European affairs, Soviet developments, the growing tensions in Germany. His analyses were sharp, prescient. People noticed. The Foreign Office began inviting him to off-the-record briefings, and he always listened, carefully. He also began cultivating a different kind of relationship, one with women who moved in the right circles. He married, briefly. Then again. His personal life was, at times, chaotic, but always contained. The British elite forgave such things, especially from men of promise. Every now and then, Moscow would test him. A courier would arrive. A message would be sent through the quiet network that existed in the shadows of London. He would receive instructions, simple on the surface, deadly in implication. Watch this man, report this meeting, attend this function, and observe who is in the room. He never refused. He never complained. And always, he reported. The scale of his double life was becoming staggering. On one side, he was a rising figure in Britain's intellectual and journalistic class. On the other, a servant to a foreign ideology, passing scraps of information that, when assembled, could shift the balance of power in ways no single man ever sees. He didn't flinch, not even when it became personal. There were whispers, from time to time, in the offices of British intelligence, men who had doubts, but every time Philby's name came up, someone laughed. "Philby? Nonsense! He's one of us." That was the point. That was the plan. He knew the empire. He spoke its language. He had grown up inside its myths, drank from its teacups, and read its bedtime stories. He could mimic its manners perfectly because he had once believed in them, or maybe because he never had, and that was the secret. To betray something, you must first understand it. There came a time in those pre-war years when Philby began to prepare for the next phase. He had done enough to earn trust. Now he needed access, real access, not just to gossip and diplomatic chatter, but to secrets, military secrets, intelligence frameworks, names, codes, and intentions. His handlers had only one directive: be patient. He was. When the Second World War broke out in earnest, it would present opportunities he had only dreamed of. But for now, he continued to play the role he'd been cast in. The perfect Englishman, the charming war correspondent, the loyal subject of the crown. And behind the smile, behind the medal he still kept in a drawer, awarded to him by fascists for bravery on a battlefield where he had served their enemies, he waited. He returned to London in the spring of 1939, tan from travel, confident, and carrying letters of recommendation from editors and generals alike. He was greeted warmly, almost triumphantly. The British elite, ever proud of its own, welcomed him with open arms. His mask was working, even better than he expected. He stood beneath the high ceilings of Broadway buildings in London, casually lighting a cigarette while a stack of telegrams waited on his desk. Outside, Britain braced for war, and inside the gray-walled offices of the Secret Intelligence Service, Harold Adrian Russell Philby, now known to most as Kim, was steadily becoming the man everyone trusted to watch the Russians. The irony would have amused him, but he never laughed at his own jokes anymore. The stakes were too high, the lies too layered, and besides, he was too good at it now, too deep, too necessary. The camouflage of patriotism had settled into his bones. He had just returned from Spain, a decorated journalist, a war correspondent whose dispatches were praised for their courage and clarity. His anti-communist articles had made their way into government briefings. British diplomats referenced him in policy memos. By all accounts, he was a golden boy of the establishment, bold, eloquent, aristocratic in bearing, yet humble in manner. The very portrait of a modern British hero. But his success wasn't just luck. It had been calculated, sculpted, and rehearsed. Every article he wrote under Franco's shadow had served a double purpose. Every public toast to British values concealed a secret nod to Moscow. Now, war was no longer an abstract European fever dream. Germany had invaded Poland. Britain had declared war. And in the storm that followed, Britain's intelligence services scrambled to find the men who could see through the fog. Men with contacts, languages, courage, and clean records. Philby was perfect. He'd never officially joined the Communist Party, never marched, never printed a single pro-Soviet line. On paper, he was the most trusted man in the room. So when Section D, the sabotage and deception wing of MI6, began assembling wartime teams, Kim Philby was quickly invited in. He didn't hesitate. He never did. It wasn't fearlessness, exactly, more like a total absence of doubt. His purpose had been forged long ago in smoky Cambridge rooms and Spanish trenches. He wasn't serving Britain. He was infiltrating it, from within, with its own approval. His first official posting in MI6 wasn't glamorous. He was assigned to a small division under Claude Dancy, a man who looked like a retired headmaster and spoke like an oracle. Dancy was already suspicious of Moscow's quiet reach and wanted a team to trace communist subversion inside Allied movements. The division was named Section 9. It sounded mundane, but its mandate was clear: monitor Soviet espionage, uncover red agents, thwart the spread of communism from inside and out. Philby almost laughed when he saw the assignment. It was perfect. From that moment, every day he came to work was another step deeper into the very heart of the empire he intended to betray. He wrote memoranda on suspected Soviet sympathizers, briefed officers on Russian tactics, proposed strategies to disrupt NKVD networks, all while feeding Soviet command the names of British agents, war plans, and counterintelligence operations. He became the mirror that distorted everything. They thought they were using him. They were wrong. His Soviet handlers, now operating through deeply buried networks, were stunned by the access he was gaining. They had sent many agents into foreign services, but none had risen like Philby. One of his early handlers reportedly said, "He believes, but more importantly, he belongs." That was what made him so lethal. Philby didn't operate on the margins. He became the center. Throughout the early war years, as London reeled under Blitz attacks and British operatives scrambled across Europe, Philby quietly expanded his web. He advised British efforts in France, coordinated intelligence assessments on Eastern Europe, and even briefed American liaison officers from the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA. His charm was a weapon. His accent, his smile, his references to cricket scores and Shakespeare quotes made him feel like home to the Americans. He gave them everything they wanted, except the truth. The Americans adored him. When Alan Dulles, head of OSS in Bern, first met Philby, he described him as an Englishman's Englishman. No one questioned the sincerity in his eyes. They only wondered how he always seemed to know more than they did. That was his gift. Not just knowing secrets, but making others forget they had any. He didn't just play the role, he shaped it. Philby began mentoring junior officers, many of whom would later rise in MI6 and MI5. He wrote internal documents so detailed and precise that they became training manuals. His knowledge of Soviet tradecraft was uncanny. He could predict their tactics, anticipate their misdirections. No one realized the reason was simple. He had once been trained by them. As the war intensified, Philby's influence grew. Section 9 became critical as Allied forces turned their attention toward post-war Europe and the growing Soviet shadow across the continent. While Churchill toasted Stalin as a wartime partner, Philby was already cataloging how the Kremlin would try to reshape the world. He sat in meetings discussing counter-espionage strategies. Then he transmitted summaries of those meetings straight to Moscow. Through invisible ink, microfilm, or memorized phrases whispered in parks, he fed the very enemy he was tasked with defeating. And yet, even he could not control the consequences of his betrayal. Far away, in dim interrogation cells beneath Lubyanka, Soviet agents began to disappear. Men who had operated in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, trusted communist organizers and informants, were arrested. Some were shot, others vanished. Their files were marked compromised. The cause, whispered through clenched jaws, was a leak. A British one. But the Soviets didn't suspect Philby. Why would they? He had only ever sent intelligence that Moscow needed to maintain its edge. If the NKVD used his information to purge its own ranks, that wasn't his burden. Or so he told himself. One particular case haunted him more than the others. A Czech operative named Oleg Lesov, whom Philby had once met briefly in Paris before the war, was executed in a forest outside Prague. His crime? Associating with Western infiltrators. Philby had mentioned Lesov's name once in a report, just once, in the context of an organizational chart. Somehow, that had been enough. For weeks afterward, he avoided looking in the mirror too long. Not because he felt guilt, but because he feared what the reflection might say. Still, he pressed forward. His mission was bigger than one life, bigger than 50. In his mind, betrayal wasn't treason, it was strategy. And the future belonged to those who could outwit the present. By 1944, he was promoted again, now overseeing broader intelligence coordination against the Soviet Union, even as Stalin's armies pushed through Eastern Europe. The Americans and British were beginning to worry. The Iron Curtain was descending long before Churchill gave it a name. And Philby, seated in briefings about the coming Cold War, played both sides like a violinist in a silent concert. He didn't just pass along documents, he passed along intentions. He told Moscow what Britain feared, what it doubted, where it felt weak. His reports were more valuable than photographs. They offered insight, psychological, cultural, emotional, into the Allied mind. In the corridors of MI6, he was lauded for his instincts. "A man who understands Moscow better than the Russians themselves," one superior said. That was true, and it was the joke that never stopped being funny, at least to Philby. But it couldn't last forever. In 1945, as the war ended and the ashes of Europe settled into the Cold War divide, whispers began. A Soviet defector named Konstantin Volkov approached British diplomats in Istanbul with a shocking offer. He claimed he knew the names of Soviet spies inside British intelligence. High up, possibly 2 or 3 in MI6. He wanted asylum, he wanted protection, and he wanted to speak directly to London. The message reached Philby first. He read it in silence. Then again. The names weren't listed, but Volkov had given enough clues that Philby knew. He was exposed. Or, very close to it. He made 2 calls, one to delay the operation, the other to Moscow. Volkov was intercepted by Soviet agents days later. Some said he was drugged and dragged onto a plane. Others said he was shot in the leg and carried. His body was never found. His file was marked closed. In London, MI6 didn't pursue the matter. They were told it had been a false lead. Volkov was dismissed as unreliable. But some officers began to wonder, why had Philby been so quick to bury it? He gave them the same answer he always gave. "The man was a fraud," he said, with that slight smile that seemed to imply he knew more than he let on, which, of course, he did. He returned to his desk, shuffled a few folders, lit another cigarette. By then, it was 1946. He had survived the war, the defector, the suspicions, and he had emerged more powerful than ever. The man now advising Britain on how to detect Soviet spies was their best one. He leaned back in his chair, staring at a map of Europe divided by barbed wire and broken treaties. There was no victory parade for him, no statue, no anthem, only the quiet satisfaction of having rewritten the rules. The war may have ended, but the game was just beginning, and he was already several moves ahead. They used to drink together, the 3 of them, Philby, McLean, and Burgess, in oak-paneled clubs and dimly lit sitting rooms where the ashtrays overflowed with cigarette ends and the brandy was poured without asking. They would talk in circles, in half-sentences, in innuendo, but always with a kind of confidence that belonged only to men who believed they'd never be caught. They had grown into the roles they once studied from a distance. Not revolutionaries in exile, but men of the establishment, clothed in tailored suits and cloaked in privilege. But somewhere along the way, the laughter grew thinner, the jokes more pointed, the eyes less trusting. The cracks in their camaraderie had been hairline fractures once. Now they threatened to split the entire edifice. It began with McLean. He had always been the careful one, the reader, the scholar, the man who saw ideology as a form of moral clarity. He read Lenin in translation and believed him. He read Marx and memorized him. He joined the Foreign Office and walked its corridors with an unspoken certainty that the higher he climbed, the more valuable he became, not to Britain, but to the Soviet Union. But by 1950, his nerves were unraveling. His hands trembled, his eyes darted, he drank too much, he shouted at secretaries. One day, he threw up in a diplomatic car after a Whitehall briefing and blamed it on bad oysters. Another time, he punched a wall in the British embassy in Cairo. The whisper passed through Washington first. There's a man in the British Foreign Office who's behaving very strangely. He has access to everything. He's drinking too much. Something's not right. The Americans had become more suspicious since the end of the war. They had their own problems. Spies embedded deep in the Manhattan Project, leaks they couldn't trace. They trusted the British, but with caveats now. And they didn't trust McLean at all. Inside the State Department, a file was opened under a code name. It would eventually lead to Venona, a decryption effort so sensitive even Truman hadn't been told at first. And there, inside a decoded Soviet message from the war years, was a reference to a spy, Homer, who had given up atomic secrets and Anglo-American diplomatic cables. The clues were vague, but slowly, painfully, British and American counterintelligence began to triangulate their man. A timetable of postings, a pattern of documents accessed. They had narrowed Homer down to 3 suspects, then 2, then 1. Donald McLean. Philby knew before McLean did. He was in Washington now. a respected liaison between British intelligence and the CIA, the man who briefed the Americans on Soviet activities while sipping coffee beside Allen Dulles. And still, every night he wrote reports to Moscow Center, coded in phrases only the Soviets would understand. When word reached him that McLean was under investigation, it didn't come in a file. It came in a tone, in a glance, in a subtle change in how the Americans treated him, like something had shifted in the room. His instincts screamed it before his contacts did. McLean was burning. And then there was Guy Burgess. Brilliant, erratic, dangerously indiscreet. He had always been the wild card in their trio. If McLean was ideology and Philby was calculation, Burgess was chaos incarnate. He drank recklessly, flirted shamelessly, insulted ambassadors to their faces, and then charmed them again by the end of the night. He had slept his way through the Foreign Office and talked too freely at dinner parties. His usefulness had once been undeniable, but now, in the Cold War's tightening grip, his flamboyance was a liability. He was living with Philby in Washington, a decision that raised eyebrows even then. The Americans were already uncomfortable with Burgess. He was openly rude, conspicuously drunk, and never quite followed protocol. He once crashed a car in downtown D.C. while intoxicated and claimed diplomatic immunity. Another time, he spilled red wine on a confidential document and laughed about it. The CIA noticed. MI6 noticed. Even Philby, always careful, began to worry. But when the news came that McLean was to be interrogated formally, imminently, it was Burgess who acted. Not officially, not with any grand plan, but as if he felt something deep in the pit of his stomach, that this was the end. The two men met one last time in secret at a country house outside London. It was raining. Burgess had driven through the night. He wore a scarf tied too tightly around his neck, as if warding off more than the weather. The conversation was brief. McLean didn't want to run. He believed he could talk his way out, but Burgess was insistent. "They know," he said. "They have you, and if they have you, they'll have me. And if they have me..." The escape was chaotic, a misstep in almost every way. Burgess was not supposed to go with McLean. He was too exposed, too compromised. His sudden disappearance would lead directly back to Philby. But Burgess ignored the plan. On May 25th, 1951, the two men vanished. They boarded a ferry to France, then a train, then disappeared entirely. For weeks, no one could say with certainty where they had gone. But in Moscow, champagne was poured. Two of their most valuable assets had made it out alive. Back in London, the reaction was volcanic. Parliament roared. Questions flew across desks in MI5, MI6, the Foreign Office. Who tipped them off? Who helped them escape? And why had no one stopped them? Philby was summoned almost immediately. He knew this moment would come. He had rehearsed it in his mind for years, ever since that first quiet nod in Cambridge. The scenario varied. Sometimes he was cool and collected. Sometimes he fled. Sometimes he confessed and spun a story so convincing it confused even himself. But when the real summons came, it was stranger than anything he had imagined. Because the men waiting to question him were not strangers. They were colleagues, friends, men he had shared jokes with in the corridors, who had toasted his promotions, who had trusted him implicitly. Now, they looked at him like a specimen. The interrogation took place over days, in a quiet room without windows. There was no shouting, no bright lights, just questions. Cold, clinical, precise. How long had he known Burgess? What did he talk about with McLean? Did he know they were in danger? Did he warn them? Philby lied, not extravagantly, not melodramatically, just enough to introduce doubt. He admitted to knowing Burgess was unstable, but denied any foreknowledge of the escape. He played the concerned friend, the confused colleague. He even expressed anger. "Why wouldn't they tell me? I could have stopped them." His voice trembled just enough to seem sincere. They listened. They compared notes. They asked the same questions twice, 3 times, from different angles. But in the end, they found nothing conclusive. Just smoke, no fire. He was let go, but something had changed. The room let him go. the building did not. From that moment on, Philby was watched. Not overtly, but he felt it. In how long it took the phone to ring after he picked it up. In the way certain faces seemed to pass by his flat too often. In how invitations from the highest circles of intelligence began to dry up. The Americans cut ties first, quietly, firmly. They told the British they would no longer share intelligence with anyone who might have connections to the Burgess McLean affair. MI6 didn't fire Philby, but they eased him out. He resigned voluntarily, took a job as a journalist again, wrote articles on Middle Eastern politics, smiled for the press. But inside, he was unraveling. Not from guilt. That wasn't in him, but from isolation, from uncertainty. Moscow Center no longer knew if he was safe. Messages were shorter, cautious. His value had plummeted, and worse, he had begun to suspect that the Soviets didn't fully trust him anymore. There was talk, whispered, denied, then whispered again, that he might be recalled, or abandoned. One night, drunk and alone, he sat on the edge of his bed and whispered aloud, "They let me go." The words sounded hollow, not like a victory, like a warning. The British had let him walk away, but they hadn't looked away. Every move he made now carried weight. Every conversation was a test, every silence a trap. Philby had survived, but survival is not the same as safety. The mask had slipped once. Now it had to be fused permanently to his face. And somewhere in a filing cabinet deep in Whitehall, a new file was opened. The name on the front was simple, just Philby Harold Adrian Russell. Inside, a note written in pencil. Suspected, not proven. Watch closely. The man who had once been trusted to protect Britain from Soviet infiltration now carried a question mark after his name. His charm still disarmed, his voice still reassured. But trust, true, unguarded trust, had died in that interrogation room. And though he walked free, every door now led to a mirror. He had tipped off the two most infamous defectors of the Cold War. He had lied to their faces. He had watched them vanish into Moscow's embrace. And they had let him go, but they never took their eyes off him again. They never found the glass. It was a trivial detail, a meaningless artifact in any other life. A tumbler half full of scotch left behind on a side table in a quiet Beirut apartment. But in the weeks that followed, when officials back in London tore through every corner of his last known address, they kept coming back to that single glass, the imprint of a thumb on the rim, the faint smell of Dunhill tobacco in the air. It was still warm, still recent, still mocking them. And by then, Kim Philby was already gone. Not just missing, gone. As if the city had swallowed him whole. No sightings, no passport checks, no luggage trails, no footprints. The man who had once moved openly among the highest tiers of British intelligence had vanished like a magician, exiting a trick he'd spent a lifetime rehearsing. One moment he was sipping gin with journalists on a rooftop in Beirut, and the next, he was a ghost. But the signs had been there for years. They just didn't know how to read them. He had accepted exile with the grace of a man who had practiced it in his sleep. After his forced resignation from MI6, there had been no protests, no denials shouted in public. He had nodded, smiled faintly, and disappeared into the shadows of his second profession, foreign correspondent. A job he had once toyed with between assignments now became his full-time armor. And Beirut, that crumbling, sun-split city perched between east and west, was the perfect place for a man with secrets. Philby arrived with nothing more than a typewriter and a story about starting fresh. He rented a modest flat overlooking the sea and filed reports on Arab politics, oil disputes, and regional instability. He drank with diplomats and argued with editors. He gave interviews in coffee houses and vanished for long stretches without explanation. And all the while, he sent reports, not to London, but to Moscow. He had not retired, he had repositioned, but he was not alone. Back in Washington, a man named James Jesus Angleton was watching. Angleton, the high priest of American counterintelligence, had once been Philby's closest friend. They had shared cigars in the Georgetown shadows and whispered over brandy about the future of Soviet espionage. Philby had mentored him, teased him, molded him. Angleton had admired him, almost revered him. But something had shifted. Perhaps it was the way Philby had defended Burgess and McLean. Perhaps it was the silence in the years that followed their defection. Or maybe it was just instinct. That sharp, acidic instinct that Angleton never fully trusted in others, but relied on in himself. He began to ask questions, and MI5 began to answer them. In quiet rooms back in London, British intelligence officers had never really closed the file on Philby. He was never convicted, never formally accused, but the suspicion that had once whispered through the corridors of Whitehall now began to solidify. A new generation of officers, less loyal to the old boys club, more obsessed with the leak in their system, started piecing the puzzle together. Patterns emerged. Dates aligned. A chilling realization crystallized. There had not been two spies in the heart of British intelligence. There had been three. Philby had been the third man all along. The phrase was whispered in parliamentary hallways, scribbled in margins of classified reports. It echoed through the minds of those who had once raised glasses to his name. If he had been the source, the leak who had tipped Moscow off about McLean and Burgess, then everything had been compromised. Every operation, every defector, every name. It was a betrayal too large to comprehend. Still, no one moved, not officially. To accuse Kim Philby without evidence was to risk scandal on an international scale. But inside MI5, the decision was made quietly, methodically. He would be brought in, questioned, contained, and if the evidence held, prosecuted. They never got the chance, because someone else warned him first. The contact arrived in Beirut posing as a journalist. He was soft-spoken, nondescript, forgettable, everything Philby was not. They met twice, briefly, in public places where voices could be disguised and footsteps were masked by traffic. The message was short, urgent, final. "They're coming," the man said. "This time, it's real." Philby didn't react, not visibly. He lit a cigarette and stared out toward the sea. But something behind his eyes shuddered, like a gate swinging closed. He had always known this moment would come. Every night spent drinking with journalists in the Levant, every line of copy filed under his false identity, every coded message sent to his Soviet handlers, all of it was a delay, not a denial. He had bought time, but time had run out. That night, he packed. Not with panic, but precision. 3 shirts, a shaving kit, an old leather-bound notebook, a folded photograph of his children. The passports were already forged, the documents smuggled weeks in advance. He made no calls, he wrote no letters, but he left behind a single note, buried beneath a stack of magazines in his living room drawer. It was addressed simply to A. He hosted one last dinner with friends. It was a casual gathering, wine, laughter, gossip. He spoke about an upcoming trip to Damascus. He joked about a local editor's poor taste in women. He filled glasses and asked about politics. No one noticed the tremor in his fingers. No one saw the tightness in his jaw. Only one man, a young reporter who had idolized Philby for years, would later admit he felt something was wrong. "He kept looking at the clock," the reporter said, "like he was waiting for a moment he couldn't explain." When the last guest left, Philby stood at the window and lit one final cigarette. The city stretched out before him, indifferent and glowing. He had lived here for years, loved here, lied here, survived here. Now it would become his final disguise. Somewhere deep inside, he knew what awaited him across the border. Moscow, the cold, the suspicion, the slow decay of trust. He was not naive. The Soviet Union was not a reward. It was a refuge, one he had earned through treachery. But still, it was his side, his cause, his destiny. At 3:12 a.m., he slipped out the back stairwell. There was no suitcase, just a coat, a wallet, and a promise made decades earlier in a Cambridge dormitory. He was driven in silence by a contact he barely knew. They didn't speak. The car took back roads, avoided checkpoints. At the final crossing, the guards waved them through without hesitation. By then, the right palms had been greased, the right names invoked. By morning, he was gone. Back in London, the reaction was swift and damning. MI5 was humiliated. Parliament demanded answers. The press exploded with headlines. Philby defects. Traitor confirmed. The third man escapes. Former colleagues were interrogated, family members hounded, the intelligence services recoiled in shame. And in Washington, James Angleton stared at the telegram for a long time. Philby had not just betrayed the West, he had betrayed Angleton personally. The friendship, the long, wine-fueled conversations, the whispered jokes about deception, all of it had been a mask. The man who had taught Angleton the rules of counterintelligence had played him from the beginning, and now he was beyond reach. Years later, when asked about Philby, Angleton would speak only one sentence: "I loved him like a brother, and he betrayed us all." In Moscow, Philby was welcomed with applause, but also with suspicion. He was given an apartment, a pension, and a handler, but not freedom, not trust. He was questioned, isolated, monitored. The Soviets had won their prize, but they never stopped wondering whether the prize came poisoned. The man who had fooled Britain for decades had finally come home. But even here, in the capital of the ideology he claimed to love, he was alone. And the Scotch glass in Beirut, still warm, still waiting, remained the last true witness to his departure. That night, he vanished. By morning, he was already over the border and gone forever. He stepped off the train with a suitcase too light for a man carrying the weight of 3 governments on his shoulders. The platform at Yaroslavsky Station was mostly empty, the snow falling in slow, quiet defiance of history. There was no delegation waiting, no handshakes, no applause, just a stocky man in a dull overcoat holding a clipboard who nodded once, turned, and walked away without a word. Kim Philby followed. He was finally home, and already the silence felt colder than the wind. Moscow had loomed in his imagination for decades, not as a city, but as a promise, a place where loyalty would be rewarded, where history would recognize its architects. He had dreamed of walking its avenues as a hero of the cause, welcomed by the very machine he had risked everything to protect. But as the gray buildings closed in around him, and the car moved silently through frozen streets, the truth began to bloom like frostbite under his skin. There would be no parade, only observation. The apartment was small, anonymous, already prepared. Its windows looked onto a courtyard littered with melting snow and peeling paint. The wallpaper was the same in every room, faded green with floral prints curling at the edges. A hot plate sat on the kitchen counter. A single telephone, likely tapped, sat on a wooden table. There was no radio, no books in English, just a made bed and a closet with 2 suits, both slightly too large for him. It was a prison without bars, and he was the only prisoner who knew the rules. The man with the clipboard handed him a key and left. No words, no instructions. The door clicked shut, and the lock turned with a sound that felt permanent. Philby was alone. He poured himself a drink from the flask in his coat pocket, the last of the decent scotch he had brought with him. The taste was a memory. London, Beirut, the scent of old cigars and betrayal. He let the alcohol burn his throat and wondered, for the first time in years, what he had actually won. The days passed without pattern. He was not allowed to leave the building without permission. A man he never saw brought groceries every Wednesday, placing them outside the door without knocking. There were footsteps in the hallway late at night. Sometimes he heard voices through the wall, not words, just the cadence of surveillance. Someone was always nearby, someone always listening. He tried to read the Russian newspapers, but only caught fragments. His Russian, never fluent, was clumsy and tired. He had spent so long immersed in the clipped precision of British speech, the sarcasm, the double meanings, the jokes within jokes, and now, in Moscow, every sentence felt like a riddle he couldn't solve. He sent a request for a language tutor. It was denied. The system he had once idealized now reduced him to a subject of interest, a liability being slowly examined under glass. They called him in for debriefings, long, repetitive interrogations delivered with bureaucratic monotony. He sat in cold rooms across from men with files thicker than any novel, answering the same questions with increasingly careful phrasing. Every word was a potential trap, every nod or pause, a note in a report he would never read. He realized bitterly that he was not trusted, not by the country he had risked his life for, not even by the ideology he had once called sacred. He wrote letters to his children in England, but they were returned or disappeared entirely. He sent a note to Eleanor, his second wife, asking after her health. No reply. The Soviet handlers encouraged him to move on, to rebuild, to show commitment. They introduced him to a woman named Rufina. She was polite, distant, careful. They married in a quiet ceremony attended by no friends. She moved into the apartment 2 days later, and from the start, they lived like strangers. He tried to make her laugh once, told her a story from his days in Cairo about a false mustache that had fallen off mid-surveillance. She stared at him blankly, then nodded, as if humor itself had been reclassified as treason. He never tried again. The drinking became a habit, then a necessity. The cheap vodka from the state store burned deeper than the scotch ever had, but it dulled the edges. He began each morning with a glass, then another in the afternoon. By evening, the bottle was usually empty. Sometimes he would talk to the radio, though it played nothing but static. He pretended it was Angleton on the other end, just to feel something like conversation again. On Sundays, he would sit by the window for hours, watching the same woman hang laundry across the courtyard. The routine was hypnotic, the flutter of white sheets, the pause to light a cigarette. He imagined she was a spy assigned to watch him, and that the laundry was coded communication. It was the only game left that made him feel alive. He was allowed to publish memoirs eventually, under tight supervision. The Soviet censors redacted names, dates, whole chapters. The result was a hollow echo of a life once lived. He didn't recognize the man in those pages, the hero of the revolution, the righteous traitor. It was fiction masquerading as redemption. He signed the proofs without reading them. The few Western journalists who came to Moscow sometimes requested interviews. Most were denied. The lucky few who gained access found a man far removed from the myth. He was gruff, often drunk, rambling. He refused to speak Russian even in public, a quiet rebellion that no one acknowledged but everyone recorded. He wore the same threadbare coat each winter, walked the same 3 blocks each morning, and spoke, when he did speak, with the bitterness of a man whose reward had always been a mirage. He had dreamed of being remembered as a hero of the left, a soldier of history, but in truth, he had become a cautionary tale, a man exiled not by his enemies, but by his own convictions. Once, in the depths of winter, Rufina found him sitting in the bath, fully clothed, muttering lines from an old poem he had learned at Cambridge. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. He was breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow collapse of identity, piece by piece, like wallpaper peeling from the walls. He saw doctors. He was prescribed pills. He ignored them. He told Rufina once that he missed English rain, the kind that smelled like books and gunpowder. She didn't understand. He never brought it up again. He dreamed of London sometimes, of lampposts and pubs, of dark suits and sarcasm, of friends long dead or long disillusioned. He imagined himself back in that safe house in Beirut, choosing differently, telling the truth, or at least a different lie. But the dream always ended the same way, with the sound of the lock clicking shut. In his final years, he began to speak more openly, not because he trusted anyone, but because he had nothing left to lose. He told a young Russian journalist that the thing he missed most about England was the ability to be wrong without being punished. The journalist didn't print it, but he remembered. When Philby died, it was in his sleep. There was no grand revelation, no last-minute confession, just the end of a story that had unraveled in slow motion. The funeral was small. A few KGB officers attended out of formality. Rufina wept quietly. Someone placed a Soviet flag over the casket, but it slipped off in the wind. His grave is still there in Moscow, marked by a name that once shook the foundations of 3 nations. But few visit. The ideologies have shifted, the wars have changed, and the man who once believed he could shape history is now a footnote in it. He never learned Russian fluently. He never came home. He stood in the portrait room of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by Rembrandts and Van Dycks, holding a goblet of sherry with the same hand that once signed messages to Moscow. His eyes, delicate and deliberate, scanned the brushwork of a 17th century masterpiece as if it were just another coded dispatch. To the staff, he was Sir Anthony Blunt, Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, surveyor of the Queen's pictures, art historian of world renown. But beneath the velvet and oil-painted elegance lay a truth so corrosive that it took 2 decades to even whisper it out loud. He wasn't just the keeper of monarchs' portraits. He was a traitor, the 4th man. And when his name finally broke through the silence, it wasn't with a shout. It was a cough, a shuffle of paper, and a glance across a table in a quiet MI5 office. Blunt had confessed. It began quietly in the early 1960s, in the cautious post-Philby years, when the service still itched from the sting of betrayal. There were rumors, always. A 5th man, a 6th. But those who knew kept quiet. Those who guessed didn't dare say it out loud. Then came a whisper, a note passed discreetly by an American source. It named Blunt with specifics, time, place, recruitment. The Cambridge connection, the same web that had snared Philby, McLean, and Burgess. Blunt had been there all along, and unlike the others, he hadn't vanished or defected. He was still in Britain, still honored, still inside. The decision was made behind locked doors. Confront him. But quietly. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed relieved. The conversation was short, unadorned, and cold. When asked, he confirmed it. Yes, he had passed information to the Soviets. Yes, he had known about Philby. Yes, there were others. But no, he wouldn't name names. He spoke of ideals, of youthful conviction, of the 1930s, but he did not apologize. Instead, he offered something else, a deal, silence in exchange for cooperation. If MI5 agreed to keep his confession secret, he would help trace other moles. Blunt, always the strategist, had calculated the cost of honesty, and for years it worked. The public never knew. He remained at court, continued to advise the Queen on her art, walked the gilded halls as if nothing had changed, even shook hands with heads of state under the very portraits he had once walked past on his way to KGB drops. But inside the service, inside the corridors of power, there was panic. Quiet, suffocating panic. How many others were there? How deep had the rot gone? The Cambridge ring, once thought contained, now seemed porous, indefinite, endless. The impact was seismic. Not on the headlines, not yet, but within the British intelligence community. MI6 launched internal reviews, MI5 redrew vetting procedures, and the CIA, already wary after Philby's betrayal, tightened its fists. Files were pulled, old associates were re-interviewed, some were quietly retired, others quietly watched. And still the silence held. Until Margaret Thatcher stood in Parliament in 1979. It had been years since Blunt's confession. He was now retired, living modestly, still titled, still untouchable. But rumors had begun to trickle out. A journalist had cornered the story, piecing together fragments from sources who were no longer loyal to the silence. The government could no longer pretend, so the Prime Minister, firm and deliberate, addressed the House. "Yes," she said, "Sir Anthony Blunt was a Soviet agent." The chamber froze, not because it was a surprise, but because it was confirmation. The unspoken had become fact. The nation erupted. Letters to editors poured in. Veterans wrote in fury. The tabloids screamed betrayal. How could a man so close to the crown, to the Queen herself, have been a spy and remain protected? Why had there been no prosecution, no trial? The official line was one of damage control. Blunt had cooperated. He had helped. His utility outweighed the spectacle of justice. But that explanation satisfied almost no one. In the pubs and drawing rooms of Britain, the conversation twisted into something more toxic. If Blunt was the fourth, and Philby the third, and McLean and Burgess made up the first and second, then who was the fifth? And was there a sixth? Names floated, then fell. Dennis Healy, Victor Rothschild, Harold Wilson. Some allegations were ridiculous, others terrifying. But the one thing everyone agreed on, there were shadows in the story that still hadn't moved. Some files remained classified, some interviews never published. The phrase "more than five" became a kind of legend, whispered on radio programs, dissected in books, speculated in Parliament. Philby, now aging in Moscow, watched the drama unfold with a strange mixture of amusement and unease. He'd always known Blunt was too careful to get caught. And yet here it was, the British establishment, bleeding in public, exposed by its own elite. In one letter he wrote, "The English are always surprised when their own lie to them. They still believe treason is a foreign disease." He wasn't wrong. Blunt, stripped of his knighthood, retreated into obscurity. No trial, no prison, just exile by another name. He lived quietly, avoided cameras, and died in 1983, still insisting that his loyalty, the bal, though misdirected, had been to humanity, not an enemy. A strange defense from a man who had betrayed friends, colleagues, and a monarch who had once trusted him without hesitation. And the mystery only deepened. Because in the wake of Blunt's fall, something darker began to emerge. Old Soviet files, released in fragments, hinted at deeper networks. Operatives who were never named, drops that were never linked. Codename Homer had been McLean, Boris was Burgess, Stanley had been Philby, but other codenames appeared: Maurice, Pharaoh, Albert. Their identities were never confirmed. Some researchers believed they were red herrings. Others were certain they pointed to a sixth, a seventh, perhaps more. The Queen never spoke publicly about Blunt, but those close to her said she was devastated, not just by the betrayal, but by the years of deception in her own house. Blunt had dined with her, traveled with her, sat beside her during moments of national pride, all while keeping Moscow informed. And now, decades later, his name remains an uneasy footnote in British history. Not quite erased, not quite explained. And in the intelligence community, the damage was long-lasting. Recruitment became more cautious, background checks more invasive. The very idea of loyalty became a question instead of a certainty. Could someone believe in Britain and still work against it? Could ideology truly outweigh personal ties? Philby, in his later years, would scoff at the question. Of course, he once told a visiting journalist, that was the whole point. But even he, even in his vodka-soaked Moscow twilight, had to admit something had shifted after Blunt. The betrayal wasn't just strategic anymore. It was intimate, and it broke something that could never be rebuilt. Some files remain sealed, some questions remain unanswered, and even now, as new historians revisit the era, they find hints of trails never followed, names half scratched out, meetings that don't match logs. There are whispers about a senior figure in the BBC, a diplomat in Rome, a professor in Oxford, all linked somehow to the same Cambridge shadows. Some say they were never caught, some say they're still out there, and some say that the web, the real web, was far wider than anyone dared imagine. Because in this story, even shadows have secrets. And the deeper you go into the archives, the more you begin to wonder, what if the fifth man was never just one man? What if the whole story, Philby, Burgess, McLean, Blunt, was only the surface? What if the betrayal went so deep, even Moscow didn't know where it ended? The silence at the heart of British intelligence didn't begin with Kim Philby, and it didn't end with Anthony Blunt. It just changed shape, changed names, but never really left. And as Parliament rose to its feet that day in 1979, one question lingered in every corner of Whitehall and beyond. If there were 5, who were the others? He once said, only half in jest, that the worst part of being a traitor was that nobody sent Christmas cards anymore. It was the kind of dry, clipped English quip he could still deliver with perfect timing, even decades after defecting to Moscow. But there was truth behind the joke. In the slow, gray decay of his final years, Kim Philby found that the deepest punishment wasn't exile or poverty or even surveillance. It was erasure, the quiet, slow unwinding of memory. Not just the forgetting of names and faces, but the disappearance of meaning. Because to betray, you must first belong. And when you belong to no one, betrayal echoes into silence. He had once believed he belonged to a cause, a classless world, a noble struggle. Then he had believed he belonged to a system, the KGB with its discipline and shadows. But in the end, he belonged nowhere. The Britain he left behind forgot him. The Russia he fled to never fully trusted him. And the ideology he clung to was slowly crumbling beneath his feet. He had traded friends for silence, loyalty for isolation, and a country for a cause that, by the end, didn't want him either. Still, he kept talking. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Philby agreed to give a series of interviews to Western journalists and sympathetic Soviet publications. They were strange sessions, half propaganda, half performance, with the old spymaster playing the role of the unrepentant ideologue. He was charming, articulate, and casually cruel, dismissing his former colleagues with a smirk and a cigarette. He would speak with pride about the Cambridge Five, about how they had outwitted the West, about how the rot had gone deeper than anyone imagined. But there was an odd fragility beneath it. His voice sometimes shook. His hands were often stained from cheap Georgian wine, and the glint in his eye, once so sharp, so precise, had softened into something murkier. He told one interviewer, "I do not regret what I did. I regret nothing." And then, moments later, he asked if the oval cricket ground still stood. When the journalist nodded, Philby stared down at his glass and muttered, "The last time I saw it, the sky was blue. It's always blue there. That's the thing about England. Even when it's gray, it's blue in memory." By then, Moscow had stopped pretending he was a valuable asset. The files were closed, the network dismantled, the Cold War was entering its strangest decade, one of stale detente and quiet desperation, and the spymasters who had defined its early years were either dead, forgotten, or trapped in ceremonial roles. Philby was one of the latter. He lived in a modest apartment on the fringes of Moscow, far from the Kremlin, visited occasionally by party officials or bored intelligence trainees who were told, "That man helped change history." Most didn't believe it. They saw a frail, aging man who talked too much and drank too early. He had married again, Rufina, a Russian woman who, by all accounts, tried to care for him. She cooked, reminded him of appointments, kept his shirts clean. But it was not a marriage of fire. It was one of maintenance. She once said, "He was kind to me, always, but part of him never came here. I don't think I ever saw all of him." Philby spent hours rereading British newspapers, dog-eared and months old, smuggled to him by contacts or sent via diplomatic channels. He would scan the obituaries, the sports sections, the crossword puzzles. He liked to read about cricket matches as if he could still see them. The rhythm, the applause, the peculiar tension of an afternoon at Lord's. Once, a visitor found him weeping over a folded clipping of the Times. The story wasn't about politics or war. It was about a baker in Sussex who had retired after 50 years. "He used to make Eccles cakes," Philby murmured. "Nobody makes them here, not properly." He tried, for a time, to mentor younger defectors, men who had fled to Moscow from the West in later years, but they didn't trust him. They found him archaic, self-important, and dangerously sentimental. Some accused him of playing both sides even now. Others simply avoided him. One American who met him briefly said, "He looked like a man rehearsing an old play no one wanted to watch anymore." Sometimes, late at night, neighbors would find him outside, drunk, slumped in the snow near the alley behind his building, muttering to himself about train schedules and cricket scores. A few times he wandered so far that police brought him home. He'd nod politely, thank them in clipped Russian, and stumble back inside. The party didn't punish him, but they did start to watch more closely. His phone, never truly silent, began to click again. There was no glamour left in it, no thrill. The spy who had once dined with diplomats, betrayed prime ministers, and rewritten the rules of Cold War espionage was now just an old man in a gray coat, alone in a city that had stopped caring who he was. He never saw his children again. He never returned to Britain. He never learned Russian fluently. Not really. He could converse, order groceries, read state news, but the idioms escaped him. The soul of the language remained closed, and in moments of frustration or anger, he would slip back into English, cursing softly like a ghost from another life. His last years blurred. Time lost its structure. He drank more. He read less. He forgot names. Sometimes he forgot what year it was. And yet, on occasion, something would ignite. A visitor would mention an old MI6 colleague, and Philby would straighten, recite details with eerie precision. A moment later, he'd forget the name of the street he lived on. When the end came in 1988, it was quiet. A stroke, followed by heart failure. He died in his sleep. Rufina found him in the morning, pale and still, one hand resting on an open crossword puzzle from the Times, dated 1962. The Soviet Union gave him a hero's burial. Uniformed guards, a wreath from the KGB, a short speech about loyalty, discipline, and service to the global proletariat. But it was all for show. Most who attended didn't know who he really was, or didn't care. There were no tears, no eulogies from comrades, no friends from Britain, no family. The man who had once walked the halls of MI6 and sent secrets across continents was lowered into the frozen Russian earth like a file being shelved and forgotten. In London, there was no official statement, no obituary in the Telegraph, no funeral mass, no memorial plaque. He was not mentioned in Parliament, not remembered by the service, and not mourned by the friends he had long since betrayed. He died a Soviet, buried with honors, but no one came from the country he loved, or the country he served. He once said that betrayal was never a lightning strike. It was a slow thaw, a steady seep of water through walls, quiet until the foundation cracked. "You don't become a traitor overnight," he quipped with a smile that had by then grown tired. "You become one cup of tea at a time." Years after Kim Philby was lowered into Moscow's frozen earth and forgotten by the country he'd once called home, the world moved on. The Cold War cooled into history books. Empires collapsed, borders shifted, enemies shook hands on tarmacs and signed papers they didn't quite believe in. But in the intelligence corridors of the New World, in London, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, his name never quite left the room. In the basement training rooms of MI6, his face still appeared on overhead projectors and slide decks. Case study: ideological penetration. Younger officers, born decades after his defection, learned to pronounce his name with the same mixture of revulsion and fascination their instructors had inherited. They studied his recruitment arc not because it was old, but because it was perfect. There had been no money, no threats, no seduction, just belief. A belief so absolute it had survived exile, shame, and abandonment. That was what terrified them. Not the betrayal of state secrets, but the clarity, the calm certainty with which he had walked into their most guarded rooms and walked out with everything. Some instructors still whispered, when the doors were closed, that Philby had never fully died, that the systems he helped build, not just the theft of secrets, but the corruption of trust itself, were still echoing through their adversaries' playbooks. He'd taught the Soviets that ideology could infiltrate where money never could, that if you made someone feel like they belonged nowhere else, they would risk everything to feel at home in a cause. That was the true damage of Philby's legacy, Not just the documents, the destroyed networks, the men who died because of his dispatches, but the infection of doubt. Even now, in every vetting interview, every quiet conversation between field officers, there was a sliver of hesitation. Who do they really believe in? The Americans studied him too, not in speeches or Senate hearings, but in the back rooms of Langley. His file remained thick, heavily redacted, cross-referenced with early CIA failures and missed signals. At first, they had dismissed him as a British problem. Then they realized how deeply he had reached into their operations, how many conversations he had overheard, how many lies he had fed them while drinking bourbon in their safe houses. The word Philby became a code, a shorthand, a warning. "Don't get Philbied" was a phrase still murmured across conference tables. They used his tactics in red team simulations. What would Philby do if he were inside our system now? The answers were never comforting. Even in Moscow, long after the Soviet Union became dust and slogans, his name lingered. Not as a hero, not exactly. More like a fable. A story told to newer recruits, not with reverence but with cautious pride. He had outplayed the West, outlasted them. And even when he stumbled, even when the Kremlin stopped trusting him, he had never once asked to come home. He died in their soil. A Soviet, at least in paperwork. That meant something. In the halls of the modern FSB, someone once said, "Philby understood us better than some of our own officers, because he believed before he arrived." But they, too, studied him like a cautionary tale. He was not flawless. He broke. He drank. He lost his edge. And in the end, he was alone. But his story didn't fade. It evolved. In the 2010s, when the world woke to a new kind of leak, digital, global, instant, the old name surfaced again. When Edward Snowden walked out with NSA secrets and disappeared into Moscow, some in Washington muttered, "Philby would have admired this one." But the comparison wasn't perfect. Snowden's motives were different, his tools modern, his politics a strange amalgam of libertarian dread and digital idealism. Still, the structure was familiar: belief over money, conviction over fear, and a burning sense that the people he betrayed had already betrayed him first. Then came others: Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Reality Winner, a chorus of whistleblowers, traitors, dissidents, depending on who told the story. The internet had made ideology viral, and with it came a new version of the old question: what makes someone betray? Is it treason to reveal secrets kept from a democracy, or is it loyalty to a higher truth? And behind that question, always lurking, was the ghost of Philby. Because he didn't sell secrets for cash. He didn't crack under pressure. He walked into betrayal with eyes open. That was the part people couldn't forget. In lectures and think pieces, the debate twisted. Was Philby a warning or a blueprint? Could a man so brilliant, so well-placed, have been anything other than a product of his time? Or was he timeless? A reminder that no system, no matter how elite, how well vetted, is immune to belief. And belief is always the most dangerous currency in history. His old friends, those who survived the collapse, were mostly gone by the time his legacy became academic. Nicholas Elliott had died without ever fully reconciling the friendship. He had once said, "I still don't know if he was evil, or if I simply never knew him at all." Anthony Blunt had passed, disgraced and forgotten, his name scrubbed from gallery plaques and university halls. Burgess had died long before, dissolving into vodka and silence. McLean had lived longer, but never louder. Of the original five, Philby had remained the most iconic, not because he was the most talented, but because he had never apologized. There were no statues, no memorials, but the echo was there. In every intelligence briefing, every security clearance audit, every whispered suspicion in a hallway. He had reshaped the language of betrayal, made it human, not monstrous, not foreign, just a man, fluent in your culture, sipping your tea, laughing at your jokes, and sending everything you said to the other side. Some in Britain wanted to reopen the files, to publish every page, but too much was redacted, too many names still classified. Some suggested there was a sixth man, others said there were more, that the Cambridge ring was just one node in a wider web, that Philby had hinted in his final years about another, a name he never wrote down, a friend no one suspected. But the files were sealed, the witness is dead, and the truth, whatever remained of it, was swallowed by the same silence that had followed him to his grave. Years later, a BBC producer found a tape in the archives, an old interview with Philby, never aired, grainy and muffled. He was older, slurring slightly, but the words were clear. "I loved England," he said. "Not the empire, not the monarchy, the pubs, the walks, the light over the Thames. I betrayed its government, not its people." He paused. "Maybe that's what makes it worse." Then the tape cut to static. Somewhere in a Moscow archive, a file marked "closed" was stamped and shelved. Snow fell over the graveyard, the name on the headstone blurred under frost. No visitors came that day, or the next, but in a briefing room in London, a trainee asked her instructor, "Would we have spotted him today?" The instructor didn't answer. Instead, he tapped the name on the slide, Philby Harold Adrian Russell, and said, "This is why we ask what you believe in." Because in the end, Kim Philby didn't destroy a country. He didn't cripple an empire. He didn't win the Cold War or lose it. What he did was simpler and far more lasting. He made everyone, everywhere, look at their best friend and wonder. And sometimes the echo of betrayal isn't a scream, it's the absence of a goodbye. There is something haunting about the quiet end of a loud life. Kim Philby, once the Prince of British Intelligence, once the trusted whisperer in London clubs and Washington corridors, died without ceremony in a city he never truly belonged to. And yet, he had chosen it. Or perhaps it was the only place left that hadn't rejected him. The man who had lived by duplicity ended in solitude, surrounded by walls he could not escape and honors he could not trust. Even in death, he remained exactly what he had always been, unreadable. Years passed, and the Cold War, which had once seemed like the permanent tension of the modern age, melted into new conflicts, new enemies, new betrayals. But Philby's story refused to settle into history. It kept resurfacing in lectures, in classified briefings, in memoirs, in hesitant conversations between old spies. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He had proven that the strongest walls were never built from secrets or guns or codes. They were built from trust. And once broken, they never quite held the same. He had fooled everyone, but not for long. What lasted longer was the consequence. Careers destroyed, networks uprooted, paranoia institutionalized. His betrayal didn't just shift alliances. It changed the psychology of intelligence itself. After Philby, no one was ever completely trusted again. Not without doubt, not without surveillance. And yet those who worked alongside him still spoke, in moments of weakness, about his charm, his warmth, his brilliance, the jokes he made, the way he seemed to belong. That was the most terrifying part. He wasn't a villain from a novel. He was human, convincing. He was the kind of man you'd have over for dinner, then realize too late that he had taken something with him when he left. Some said he died believing in communism. Others said he died disappointed in it. Still others said he no longer believed in anything at all. Maybe he had believed only in betrayal itself, the pure act of subversion, the ultimate proof of control. Or maybe he had simply wanted to belong to something, anything that made him feel important. We'll never really know. That was his final triumph, ambiguity. But what endures is the question he left behind. It isn't just who else or how did he get away with it. It's something more personal, more uncomfortable. Would we have seen him coming? Would we have believed him? Or, worse, would we have liked him? Philby once said, "I have always operated on the assumption that the best way to keep a secret is to tell the truth, in such a way that no one believes you." He lived that paradox every day, folding his truths inside lies, offering honesty as camouflage, weaponizing charm as insulation. In the end, he wasn't just a spy. He was a mirror, a reflection of the cracks in every institution, every friendship, every nation that thought itself untouchable. Now his grave lies quiet. No flowers, no pilgrims, just a name, a few dates, and decades of suspicion in his wake. The world turned without him. But the intelligence world never truly escaped him. He remains, not as a hero or a villain, but as a lesson carved in silence. Because betrayal doesn't echo like a gunshot. It settles like dust, and it never fully leaves the room.